Well, good morning. Good morning, Factory. Everybody that's tuning in online, thanks for carving time out to be together as a church. And just want to say Happy New Year. Oh, I love it. I'm not sure what your New Year's traditions are. I have a few. One of my New Year's traditions is every New Year's Eve, I head to my local tire repair shop. And, I just go and visit. And, it's just that then I'll know it'll be a good year. Oh, you know what? What's not fair is that I get given a mic and you have to listen to what I have to say. Maybe if you're tuning in online, you can at least turn that off. Eh? Oh, goodness. Anyway, it's great to be with you. And this week we find ourselves together as a church, turning the pages in our lit Bible reading. If you're tracking along, we're doing 30 weeks of walking through the New Testament together. But we turned our lit Bibles into the book of John. And so we are reading this together, and it brings us to our fourth week in this series we're calling 'Tis the Season, as we bring our holiday season to a close together. And I want to say today that what I'd like to suggest that 'tis the season for imagination. For imagination. The Christmas season is shaped by imagination. It's a time when we sort of lean into possibility, when the lights maybe felt a bit brighter, or generosity feels closer, or even the things that we can't quite see feel a little bit more real. There's a sense of wonder in the air that invites us to believe the world might be more than it usually appears. It's a season of imagination. Children feel it instinctively, and if we're honest, some of us adults try to as well. But to do this today, I want to turn our attention to John chapter 5, and I'm going to read the first 11 verses, and this is where we're going to spend our time in this story we find in John chapter 5. If you brought your lit Bible, you can open it up and read along, otherwise it'll be on the screen. It says this: "Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed." And this next section I'm going to read, if you're following in your lit Bibles, you're going to notice that it's not in there. But if you look down in the footnotes, it is, because some ancient manuscripts have this verse, some don't. The reality is, in the end, it doesn't matter, because what we read later explains what this verse is. But I'm going to include it for our time here. And it says this: where these people used to lie, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." And then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" And so in John chapter 5, we find this fascinating story. One that invites us to slow down for a minute and actually step into the environment to understand what's actually happening here. John doesn't rush into this story of this miracle, but he wants to sort of set the stage, set the world that Jesus is in. And we want to step into that because this setting matters. This isn't some just symbolic backdrop or a vague spiritual scene. It is a story grounded in a real place with real people and a very real suffering. John tells us that this takes place in Jerusalem during one of the Jewish festivals, a time when the city would have been crowded and alive with movement, people everywhere. He places it near the sheep gate, which is where sheep were actually brought into the city to be sacrificed at the temple. And so near this gate was a freshwater pool fed by an underground spring known as the Pool of Bethesda, a name that means house of mercy. For centuries, actually, many wondered if John was speaking about a real location at all, because there was no trace of a pool near the sheep gate in Jerusalem. And the description of 5 covered colonnades seemed strange, even implausible, because an idea of like a 5-sided structure doesn't match any architecture at the time. So many assumed John was maybe using symbolism rather than a memory. But archaeology eventually caught up to the text. In the late 19th century, excavations near the sheep gate uncovered a massive pool complex. And what emerged wasn't small or quiet, but 2 large rectangular basins divided by a wall, creating 5 colonnades, each covered exactly as John had described. And what's been uncovered is a larger than Olympic-sized swimming pool with sections that descended more than 40 feet deep. John wasn't embellishing for the story, he was remembering. And that scale, the scale of this place matters, because when John tells us that there was a great number of blind or lame or paralyzed or sick people gathered there, we can kind of picture this scene now. This wasn't just a handful of people waiting quietly. It was a large public complex filled with every kind of struggle and brokenness. A place defined by suffering and a desperate search for help. At unpredictable moments, it says that the waters would just stir. And when they did, it said the first person to reach the pool would be healed. Whatever was happening there was real enough to draw these crowds in mass looking for hope day after day, year after year, living between hope and disappointment. And it's there in the middle of this vast, crowded, desperate scene that Jesus shifts the focus away from the multitude down to one man. One unnamed man on a mat. A man who had been living with his suffering for 38 years. John says, when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, John 5:6, this detail is easy to miss, but it matters. The system had categorized him. The crowds normalized him. And time had essentially rendered him invisible. But Jesus saw him. I mean, think about what 38 years of suffering in this situation actually means. 38 years ago is when the Winter Olympics was hosted in Calgary, if you can remember that. 38 years ago is when Die Hard hit the theaters. And when Don't Worry, Be Happy aired on the radio. This wasn't just a season of suffering for this man. It was a lifetime. A lifetime of hope, waiting for potentially the right moment, only to watch someone else move ahead again and again. And I'm convinced Jesus is doing something far deeper than simply adding another healing story to the gospel. As John has been showing us, as we've been reading along John is trying to show us something about God's kingdom. That these moments aren't random, they're revealing, they're pulling back the curtain to show us the kind of kingdom Jesus is bringing to our world. And the limits that we have in our world that we live inside of. So let me say clearly as we dive into this story together today, of what I don't think this story, or what it is not. I don't think this story is a formula for healing. I don't think it's even an explanation. It's not meant to be an explanation. Why is some healed and some not? John isn't trying to build a theology about healing here. This miracle, this story becomes a window for us to look into God's kingdom. And as we look through it, I want to draw out what I found is 4 observations that show us not just one man's healing, but what Jesus reveals about the world which had grown comfortable with suffering. Observation number 1. When structures shape suffering. Before we focus on this man himself, we need to ask a bigger question. What does the Pool of Bethesda say or reveal about the world around this man? Bethesda was not necessarily chaotic. It had become for them a functional system of hope with those who had nowhere else to turn. Healing was believed to happen here, but only under very specific conditions, only when the water was stirred, and only for one person, and only for those who got there first. It wasn't a place overflowing with mercy. It was an economy of hope that was built on scarcity and competition. Hope existed, but access was unpredictable and uncertain. John tells us that a great number of sick and physically struggling people gathered there, not because healing was plentiful, but because desperate hope kept them waiting. Over time, that waiting became organized for that society. And over time, it trained everyone, including those who were suffering, to accept long-term brokenness as the norm, something that was to be managed and observed and kept to the sidelines. Systems create categories. Jesus sees their story. And here's something that's easy to miss. This man never asked Jesus to heal him. He doesn't cry out. He doesn't demonstrate faith. He doesn't even know who Jesus is afterwards, which tells us something profound. God's kingdom is not reactive. It's disruptive. Notice what Jesus doesn't do here. He doesn't fix the pool. He doesn't make access to it fairer. He doesn't improve the system. He exposes that the system itself was never the source of healing. Jesus is writing a story that transforms scarcity into possibility. Bethesda wasn't a cruel place. It started as a place of hope, but over time, care shifted to containment. And that's something we ought to pay attention to. Any system, social, medical, religious, can drift from restoring people to simply managing them. The danger isn't cruelty, it's when systems remain but restoration quietly disappears. Bethesda gathered suffering into one visible place, offering just enough hope to feel compassionate while allowing the rest of society to remain clean and uninterrupted and comfortably distant. And when hope is structured this way, it doesn't just manage the needs, it shapes identity. It trains people to carry hope carefully or cautiously, to expect obstacles and to brace for disappointment before they can dare to believe. And it's not hard for us to find echoes of this today. Stories that we've discovered in Eswatini, like an orphan child being raised by a sibling, barely able to afford food, and they walk over an hour to get to school every day, doing everything right that they can, but they miss one school payment and lose an entire semester of work. Or I'll never forget the moment we visited an HIV ward at a public hospital, but as we were walking to the ward, we had to step around dozens of pregnant women in labor on the lawn outside, hoping that maybe a bed might open before delivery. Or if we bring it closer to home, all we have to do is just take a drive downtown. We know what we see is not right. But slowly we watch judgment replace compassion as fatigue sets in over these issues. Bethesda quietly teaches us this worldview. Those who get well deserve it. They were fast enough, they had enough help, and they were worthy enough. But that doesn't match my experience. This Christmas, I had a chance to share an update for Riverwood House to our many partners and donors that have been a part of this project. And so, we now have been open for 3 years, and we have 3 years of data to kind of gather together. And with these numbers, there was a lot to celebrate. And so I'll throw this up. This is what we shared. I'm not going to go through it all, but I want to draw your attention to one of these numbers, the number 64. 76 residents of Riverwood House to date have transitioned from living there into community, which is amazing. And of that, as we track the data, 64 of those 76 who have transitioned continue to be stably housed. That's an incredible stat. It's something that we celebrate. But here for a moment, I want to talk about the 12. Not as statistics on a paper, but these are people that I know by name, that we know their stories, people that were working courageously towards their recovery. And what we know is that the line between stability and the street is razor thin. Bethesda shows us that same razor-thin line long before we had language for it. When water is stirred, the man on the mat essentially had no chance. And when systems like this persist long enough, they don't just shape outcomes, they begin shaping how people understand themselves. Which leads me to observation number 2. When struggle becomes identity. One of the most unsettling moments in this story comes when Jesus asks a question that sounds completely unnecessary. He looks at the man and he says, "Do you want to get well?" It's a ridiculous question. 38 years, his whole life has been organized around this desperate hope of maybe becoming well. But that's exactly why this question matters. Because after 38 years, this man's struggle had become more than just something that he carried. It became something that identified who he was. It doesn't just describe his condition, it explains who he is in this world. The mat tells his story. Not because he chose it, but because the system has taught him who he is. And this is critical. The man had not yet given up. He still believes healing happens here. He believes that the waters matter, that something is there. He believes that something real is possible, but his belief has been shaped by the structure he's lived inside. Healing is possible, just not for someone like me. And that's the identity 38 years has quietly formed in his world. Notice how he answers Jesus. Jesus asks him, do you want to be well? He's asking him about his desire, and the man answers with what? His obstacles. He says, I have no one. Someone else always gets there ahead of me, and I have no one to help me in. This isn't a lack of desire. It's an imagination that's been trained by a system that says hope is not meant for me. His story had shifted from hope to be well to why this will never happen. And that's what long-term struggle often does. Slowly, without intending to, our struggle becomes our identity. Let me say something to you. The mat may tell your story, but it should not get to write your future. Sometimes the hardest thing to heal isn't the wound itself. It's our ability to imagine ourselves whole again. And maybe that's the question Jesus is asking you today. Not an accusation, but an invitation. Do you want to be well? Have you quietly let your struggle define who you are? Have the obstacles become the story that you've learned to live inside? And this leads us to our next observation, one that invites us to listen a bit more closely, because it reshapes how we understand healing and our role in it as the people of the kingdom. Observation 3, healing begins when isolation ends. When the man answers Jesus, he says something simple and devastating. He says, "Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool." Before this is a story of healing, it is a story about isolation. Think about what 38 years has done, not just to his body, but to his sense of connection. No one to rely on. No one who has his back. No one to help him into the water. Nobody to watch to see when it's going to happen and be on his side. No one to help when that moment comes. John tells us there was a great number, a multitude of people gathered at this pool, and yet this man is utterly alone. And notice how he names his pain. He doesn't say the system is broken. He says, I have no one. What began as a structural failure has slowly become personal. Over time, the weight of this system has been absorbed into his own sense of worth. And this is one of the quiet dangers that we face in our struggles. Not just that people suffer, but that they begin to suffer alone. Support erodes, community drifts, struggle remains, but connection disappears. Now, the honest reality is that Jesus doesn't somehow promise a world that's free of suffering here and now. Scripture never pretends that brokenness simply just will disappear from our midst. God's kingdom is not a denial of the pain, but it is a refusal to let the struggle define our story. One of the most profound ways God begins restoring wholeness in a broken world is not always by removing the struggle, but by restoring connection within it. Years ago, when we stepped into the recovery work that we're doing at Riverwood House, when we were building it, I heard somebody say something that has gripped me ever since I heard it. And it said this: the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Listen, before anything changes in this man's body, something changes in his world. Somebody stops. And somebody sees, and somebody speaks. Healing begins with presence, not with outcome. Because God is in the business of restoring wholeness, not just making life more manageable. This is true of illness or of grief or of mental health or of poverty or the traumas that we experience. Even in unresolved struggle, connection is a catalyst for the kind of wholeness God's kingdom offers. Here and ultimately later. And this, I believe, is where the story turns toward us. If the kingdom Jesus brings consistently moves itself towards those who have no one, the lonely, those who belong, don't have a sense of belonging, then that kingdom carries a responsibility to those who belong to it. Not to be at arm's length, not through systems alone, but through proximity. The call of God's people is not simply to care for needs from a distance, but to change the script all over that reads, I have no one. Because forging connection is where isolation has taken root. So forging connection where it has taken root, it's not an optional kindness for us to display. It's the kingdom work. It's precisely here when the man is on the mat and he names his isolation that Jesus' response begins to actually dismantle and unsettle the system itself, which leads us to our final observation together. Observation number 4, exchanging control for compassion. Now be careful, because this one can be a little bit easy to miss at first glance, but it matters. Jesus doesn't just heal the man. He disrupts the religious system that has formed around his suffering. After 38 years of needing it, the man no longer needs his mat once Jesus is done. Which makes Jesus' instruction quite curious, because he says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. That instruction is not necessary unless he's trying to say something else. The mat becomes an unmistakable statement, a public disruption of the systems that had grown comfortable keeping the need at a distance. Jesus could have healed quietly and avoided any offense, but he doesn't. And the response was immediate. The healed man is not celebrated, he is questioned. We read, it's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat, is what he said, what the leaders say. They were more concerned with maintaining control than they were of celebrating the restoration that had just happened. 38 years of pain had been healed, and the focus landed on compliance. Jesus is not rejecting the law. He's exposing how it had been reshaped into a system of control. The man is healed, the leaders are offended. This tension in the story is not accidental, it is revealing. By telling the man to carry his mat into a public space, Jesus introduces a kingdom that is disruptive to the system around it and the world around him. And it leaves us with a necessary question together. Have any of our well-intended structures begun protecting what's familiar instead of moving people towards healing? Have we designed systems that sound compassionate but keep brokenness at a safe distance? Because the kingdom that Jesus brings isn't designed to preserve control, it's designed to restore people. Jesus wasn't just healing a man, he was revealing a different order, a kingdom where mercy outruns hierarchy, where people matter more than the procedures. And the question that lingers for us is not whether we admire this kingdom, but whether we're willing to live it. I don't think we get to file this story away as Another miracle Jesus performed that was impressive, but ultimately beyond our involvement. Yes, Jesus heals whom he heals. That's true, but I believe this story is far less about observing divine power and far more about Jesus inviting us to step into his kingdom story. So back to where we started. 'Tis the season for imagination. You might wonder what that has to do with anything that we've talked about and whether I picked up the wrong script. But I'd like to suggest to you that it has everything to do with it. The man on the mat had not stopped hoping, but he had stopped imagining a world where healing could belong to him. Years of waiting had trained his heart to expect and to know that obstacles instead of possibility would be his story. And Jesus doesn't just heal his body, he restores his imagination, interrupting the belief that wholeness is always just out of reach. That's the invitation of the kingdom. Not to explain away brokenness or to manage it at a safe distance, but to imagine a world shaped by God's abundance rather than his scarcity. By connection rather than isolation. And to resist systems that trade kingdom imagination for control. To learn to see people not by what they've been lying on, but by who they can become. Restoration is imagination that refuses to accept brokenness as the final word. Because, church, Jesus is still walking into crowded spaces that are full of disappointment and struggle and desperate hope and pain. And he's still calling people to stand up. He's still restoring imagination of what can be. And he is still making wholeness possible in our world. And that, my friends, is the kingdom work that he has entrusted to us. So thanks for listening. That's my take on John chapter 5 and this story that we've read together. We're going to take a moment to close in worship. If you're able, you can stand with us as we worship.